One of the kind of recurring arguments in AI Twitter, and we've talked about it on the podcast as well, as kind of this idea around bias in these models coming only from the data versus the other aspects of the system, the architecture of the models themselves. Emily, you and I may have talked about this last time. In the case of language models, we talk a lot about the data being the source of bias. How is that kind of conversation of the broader sources of bias? How does that play out in terms of language models?
So I think that, first of all, I just want to go on record as saying that I think that this no, it's only in the data move that sometimes people make is really just a deflection and a way to say, to try to carve out a space where if all you're doing is working on architecture, then none of this is your responsibility. And it's just not true, right? Mm-hmm. So if you want to think about how does learned bias in some sort of machine learning model cause harm in the world, then all the pieces matter. So what's in the data, how the data was collected, how the data was documented. Can you actually tell what's in the data? The model itself. So what's it learning from the data? To what extent is it sensitive to, outliers versus high frequency things? There's model parameters there. What were you optimizing for as you were training the model and designing the model? And then how is the model sitting in its deployment context? So at every step of the way, there is part of the story of how bias in the data can end up as harm in the world. And so, yeah, to a certain extent, if we could come up with a completely clean, and this does not exist, completely clean, unbiased data set, then what the rest of the steps did wouldn't matter as much. But also, if you could come up with a model that was somehow impervious to learning bias, which is equally impossible to coming up with an unbiased data set, then it wouldn't matter what bias is in the data set. So everyone's got a responsibility, and trying to say, that's not my problem, is being part of the problem. So
I just realized that for people working on architectures and machine learning and optimization who say it's the data, it's the same argument as, it's the pipeline problem for diversity in tech.
Hiring and diversity.
It's what happened before. I have no part. This is from before. But also speaking to that, to what Emily's saying and the interplay between data and model, your choice of loss function minimally is packing in normative decisions about how the model should behave. So you use something like L1 loss, L2 loss, which is super common across statistics and especially in machine learning. You're making the value judgment that different kinds of errors are basically the same because they use absolute measurements. So even these very, very basic fundamentals of machine learning pack in value judgments about how to treat different kinds of errors. And that really affects what the model will learn and how it will propagate different kinds of issues.